You wake up feeling fine. You go to work. A week later, your coworker is dead. Turns out you had an illness and didn't know it. Are you responsible? Most people would say no. But now, change one thing. You knew you were sick. You went to work anyway. Your coworker caught it. Your coworker died. Are you responsible now? That question gets harder. And it gets harder still when you add one more layer. What if you knew you were making people sick, but you genuinely could not feel it? What if the disease lived inside you without ever affecting you? And every time someone told you the truth, some part of you simply could not accept it. That is the question at the center of today's case, and it has no clean answer. On today's episode of Women That Kill, we look at Mary Mallon, the woman history remembers as Typhoid Mary. She never held a weapon. She never threw a punch. She just went to work. And people died. The government decided she was so dangerous that they locked her away for the rest of her life, 26 years in total, on an island in the East River, for a crime she may not have fully understood she was committing. This case helps us understand one of the most enduring tensions in public health: the conflict between protecting a community and protecting an individual. Where does the government's right to contain a threat end? And where does a person's right to live their own life begin? To truly understand Mary Mallon's story, you have to understand what typhoid fever was and how recently humans had learned anything useful about it. For most of recorded history, people had almost no accurate understanding of how disease worked. When someone got sick, the explanations were supernatural God's punishment, witchcraft, or moral failing. The idea that invisible living organisms, bacteria, could cause disease was genuinely radical when it emerged in the 19th century. Scientists like Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, and John Snow built the foundation of what we now call germ theory, transforming medicine from superstition into science. It was Koch who identified Salmonella typhi, the bacterium that causes typhoid fever, in the 1880s. Typhoid fever produces high fever, severe stomach pain, and diarrhea. Symptoms develop gradually over 1 to 3 weeks after exposure. It spreads through contaminated food and water, specifically through contact with an infected person's feces. In the late 1800s, before clean water infrastructure was widespread, it killed approximately 10% of those it infected. But here's the detail that makes Mary Mallon's case so medically significant and so legally complicated. Mary was an asymptomatic carrier. The bacteria lived inside her body, multiplying in her gallbladder without ever making her sick. She had no fever, no stomach pain, no diarrhea, no indication whatsoever that anything was wrong. She felt healthy because, in every way she could perceive, she was healthy. She was also, unknowingly or not, infectious to everyone whose food she touched. She was the first person in the United States ever identified as a healthy carrier of typhoid fever. The medical community had known that asymptomatic carriers could theoretically exist, but Mary Mallon was the proof. Mary Mallon was born in 1869 in Ireland, at a time when Ireland was still recovering from the devastation of the Great Famine, and when emigration to America had become one of the primary survival strategies for millions of Irish families. There is a detail in her early biography that carries medical significance in retrospect. Her mother may have contracted typhoid fever while pregnant with Mary. Whether that early exposure shaped Mary's unusual relationship with the bacterium and her ability to carry it without being sickened by it is something medical historians continue to discuss. At 15, Mary emigrated to the United States to live with an aunt and uncle. She arrived as part of one of the largest waves of Irish immigration in American history. Millions of people crossing the Atlantic in search of work, stability, and a life that Ireland's economic devastation could not provide. In America, Mary began working as a domestic worker for wealthy families. She started as a maid but trained as a cook, and the distinction mattered enormously in the world she inhabited. In early 20th century America, women who worked in domestic service occupied a narrow economic landscape, and within that landscape, being a cook rather than a maid meant something real. Cooks were considered skilled workers. They managed the kitchen. They were harder to replace. They earned more money and commanded more respect than the women scrubbing floors beside them. For an Irish immigrant woman with no formal education and limited options, being a skilled cook was a genuine form of upward mobility. Mary was good at her work. She was reliable, professional, and sought after. By 1906, she had built a reputation that kept her employed by the wealthiest families in New York. And everywhere she cooked, people got sick. In the summer of 1906, a wealthy New York banker named Charles Henry Warren rented a mansion in Oyster Bay on the North Shore of Long Island for the season. He brought his family and staff. He hired Mary Mallon as his cook. Between August 27th and September 3rd of that year, 6 of the 11 people in the household contracted typhoid fever. Typhoid in this neighborhood was alarming precisely because of where it occurred. By 1906, the disease was understood to be associated with contaminated water and unsanitary conditions, with poverty, with overcrowding, with the tenement districts of Lower Manhattan. It was not supposed to be appearing in a wealthy banker's summer mansion on Long Island. Something was wrong. Warren hired a sanitary engineer, George Soper, to investigate. Soper interviewed everyone in the household, traced the water supply, examined the food sources, and looked at every variable he could identify. He kept arriving at the same conclusion: Mary Mallon. Soper reconstructed Mary's employment history. He located her previous employers, all wealthy families in New York's most exclusive neighborhoods. He found that she had cooked for 8 families. 7 of them had experienced typhoid outbreaks. 22 people had contracted the disease. Some had died. Soper approached Mary and explained what he had found. He told her she was the source. He asked for stool, urine, and blood samples. Mary threw him out. Soper took his findings to Dr. Biggs at the New York Department of Health. The department took the case to the police. An arrest warrant was issued. What happened when officers went to collect? Mary has been described differently by different sources. But by most accounts, it was not peaceful. Mary was forcibly taken into custody. She was compelled to provide biological samples. The results confirmed what Soper had suspected. Her stool tested positive for Salmonella typhi. She was transferred to Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island, a small island in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island, and quarantined in a cottage on the grounds. During her 2-year confinement, 120 of her 163 stool samples tested positive for the bacteria, a positive rate of approximately 73%. Most people who carry typhoid stop testing positive after 2 to 4 weeks. Mary's results never cleared. Doctors proposed treatments. Nothing worked. They offered to remove her gallbladder, the organ where the bacteria appeared to be concentrated. Mary refused. She did not trust the medicine. She did not trust the doctors. And perhaps most fundamentally, she did not fully accept the diagnosis because she felt completely healthy. And the idea that her body was harming people without her knowledge or consent was not something she could make peace with. In 1910, a new health commissioner took over in New York and made a different decision. He believed that permanent quarantine was unjust. He offered Mary a compromise. She would be released if she promised never to work as a cook again. She agreed. She was set free. Mary changed her name to Mary Brown and immediately took a job as a cook. Understanding why she did this requires an honest look at the economics of her situation rather than judgment. The wage gap between a cook and a maid in early 20th century America was not trivial. It was the difference between a skilled professional and an unskilled laborer in status, in pay, and in the degree of control she had over her own working life. Mary had spent years building expertise in a field that gave her the closest thing to independence and dignity that her circumstances allowed. Being told she could never cook again was being told to give up the only real professional identity she had ever built. She went back to what she knew, and she took a job in the one place where the consequences would be most severe. Mary Mallon became a cook in a maternity ward at Sloan Hospital for Women in Manhattan. Within 3 months, at least 25 people, doctors, nurses, and staff, contracted typhoid fever. 2 of them died. Investigators traced the outbreak back to Mary almost immediately. She was arrested again. This time, there was no negotiation. The court found her to be a public health danger. She was returned to North Brother Island. She never left again. Mary Mallon lived on North Brother Island for the rest of her life, 26 years, from 1915 until her death on November 11, 1938. She was 69 years old. An autopsy confirmed what had long been suspected. Live Salmonella typhi bacteria were found in the gallstones of her gallbladder, exactly the organ the doctors had wanted to remove 30 years earlier. By the time of her death, New York health officials had identified more than 400 people who were healthy carriers of Salmonella typhi. None of them was forcibly confined. None of them spent decades on an island. None of them became the subject of a legal precedent that permanently deprived them of their freedom. Only Mary. And here is the detail that demands examination. Mary Mallon worked exclusively in wealthy neighborhoods. Her victims were exclusively affluent. The New York Department of Health, which pursued Mary with the full force of its legal authority, had never applied that same energy to the typhoid outbreaks that devastated the poor communities of Lower Manhattan, where the disease killed far more people, far more frequently, with far less response from the institutions that were supposed to protect them. When poor people got typhoid, the prevailing assumption was that their poverty had caused it through unsanitary habits, unclean living, and moral failures. The disease was their fault. When wealthy people got typhoid from a cook they had invited into their immaculate summer homes, it was a public health emergency requiring government intervention. Mary Mallon was Irish. She was poor. She was a domestic worker. She was a woman. And she had the misfortune of making sick the only class of people whose suffering the authorities were prepared to take seriously. Whether what happened to her was justice or something else entirely is a question this case has been asking for more than a century, and it has never been fully answered. At the end of every episode, if I can find the killer's birthday, I take a look at their zodiac sign because it gives us an interesting lens through which to view who they were. Mary Mallon was born on September 23, 1869. That makes her a Libra, right on the cusp of Virgo, the sign most associated in astrological tradition with health, the body, and the careful management of physical well-being. Libras are known for their deep need for fairness and balance, for their conviction that justice matters and that the scales should be even. They are people who resist control, who push back against authority when they believe it is overstepping. They can be deeply stubborn when they feel that something fundamentally unjust is being done to them. And they have a complicated relationship with truth, particularly with the truths they do not want to accept. When you look at Mary through that lens, something human and tragic comes into focus. She was not a monster. She was a woman who had built a life out of almost nothing, who had developed a skill that gave her dignity and income, and who was then told by a system she had no reason to trust that her body was a weapon and her only choices were obedience or confinement. She chose defiance, and the consequences were severe. But the question of whether those consequences were proportionate, whether any individual deserves to lose 26 years of freedom for a disease she could not feel, is one that Libra's instinct for fairness would never stop wrestling with. Mary Mallon wrestled with it until the day she died. So should we. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to learn more, check out my playlist. There are plenty more stories waiting for you.